This week on Viral History, we sit down with historian and author Jeremy Black to explore Britain's fraught history with Europe. Filmed at the fantastic Chalke Valley History Festival.
Both sides, the Remainers and the Brexiteers, simplify Britain's relationship with continental Europe. That the relationship inherently has been complicated and there has never been one view on Britain's relations with the continent. It has always been the case that for reasons of religion or politics or commerce, some people have been more pro-relations with the continent and others have been pro them in going in a different direction. There is no reason to believe that that will change through time. We were already semi-detached from Europe prior to the referendum. We'd already determined that we weren't going to join the euro, which in some respects is more significant than the referendum. And whatever happens in terms of staying or leaving the European Union, we intend to remain a member of NATO, which is our principal foreign policy commitment and defence commitment. So there are British troops at the moment in Estonia, for example. There will be confronting the Russians. There will go on being British troops in Estonia. And I argued that there was a degree of laziness in which people on both sides tried to have this idea that there was an essential identity to the country, and what a surprise that identity conformed with their views. I found that an interesting way to approach the subject. It reflected the approach I'd taken in my book, Britain and Europe, because what it tried to do was look for commonalities between the two sides. And what I find disappointing is that so many people who've written on or speak on Britain's relations with Europe are intent on one answer or the other. Now, if I can go on from that to make a general point about history. History is something in which there is by its very nature not a definitive account. We cannot say with certainty why something happened, and we cannot also say that everybody either agreed or disagreed. This notion of a so-called zeitgeist, a spirit of the age, in which everybody in a certain period thought the same way, that's ridiculous. And it's become more ridiculous as British society is splintered, and the basic splintering in the 16th century, and let me make this point, I'm not a religious person, but the basic splintering in the 16th century was the Reformation. Thereafter, a tranche of the population, particularly in Ireland, but not just in Ireland, were Catholics, and their view of Britain's relations with Europe were always going to be different to those of Protestants. As we've had from the 19th century, mass education, compulsory education, which is free at both primary and secondary levels, and everybody becoming literate, so correspondingly more people have taken a view on politics. They've been encouraged to take a view as the vote extended first to men and then to women, and therefore one shouldn't be surprised that there is an inherent variety in ideas. This will not change in the future, and people who fondly imagine that there is going to be a history of one view are people who are misinformed and also misleading others. It is all too easy to imagine that everybody has the same view. And there's a particular problem here, the notion of false consciousness. In other words, the idea that if only people understood the subject clearly, they would be bound to agree with me, whoever me is, and that because they don't, it's because they've been misinformed. That is a nonsense. There has always been a diversity of views. And I drew out, for example, the period where we're all told we all shared the same opinion, the Second World War, and you can actually see that between 1939 and 1941, when there was the Communist pact, the Soviet Union's pact with Nazi Germany, during that period, a lot of people on the far left did not support the war effort and often went on strike. But that has been elided out of our consciousness because we're all supposed to think that we all had the same view, and it's only the modern day that in some reason people have been divided. There have been many episodes in the nation's history, they've been polarised, and there will be many episodes in the future. I also argued in favour of the notion of discontinuity, that we shouldn't assume that there is a continuity of historical experience, which we should instead assume that there are always discontinuities. We're going through a period of discontinuity at the present day. There will be other periods of discontinuity, and people need to be aware of that. Britain fought on the continent as part of major alliance systems in which they were allied to some European people and opposed to others. I mean, you could argue that we've seen that in wars like the War of the Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II. So in other words, our experience has generally been, not invariably, but generally been as a military power, particularly an army power, of large-scale commitments to continental power politics. That doesn't mean you should or shouldn't support the European Union. The great problem is so many people read from the past to the present, and they'll say something like, oh well, we were part of a European coalition in World War II, therefore we should be a member of the European Union. That's a nonsense. And indeed, one thing that's worth bearing in mind is the largest of all European states is one that isn't in the European Union, namely Russia. There is no essential identity between ideas of Europe and the European Union. I always write on several books at once. I'm doing a book on strategy in World War II. There are lots of excellent books by many people speaking at this festival on the operational level and tactical level of World War II. There hasn't been the same effective multinational coverage of strategy, and that's what I intend to try and tackle next. But you won't be surprised to hear that I also have intentions of other books. I've got An England in the Age of Shakespeare coming out, and that's being followed next year by An England in the Age of Austin, and I also write national histories. I brought out a short history of Italy last year. This year a short history of Spain is coming out. Next year will be a short history of Portugal. That's already written, in the can and accepted, so that will be out next year. And in that series I'm doing a short history of the Mediterranean after that.